Kia ora koutou, ko tarawera te maunga, ko rangitaki te awa no whakatāne ahau, ko Joe Warder hau. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Kia ora and warmest greetings from Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm Joe Ward and I live in Auckland and I work for a teacher training provider, Rito Maioha. I am here today to provide a PowerPoint presentation of the symposium I did at the BERA conference in 2025, exploring te whāriki and the power of belonging in early childhood education. Ko Io, who am I? A little bit more about me. So growing up, I never really thought about belonging. I didn't have to. I was part of a dominant culture and I grew up in a very small farming community. Everybody knew everybody. We shopped at the same shop, we went to the same school, we played at the same sports ground. We had to. There was only one. At the age of 12, I went to high school and I went to boarding school many, many miles away. And high school was challenging for me. I wasn't overly successful, and I've come to realize that it was challenging for reasons I didn't understand at the time. But we'll come back to that a little bit later. Leaving school at 16, I became an early childhood teacher, and this is where I began my knowledge of belonging and the importance of belonging for teaching and learning. Early years education in New Zealand is underpinned by our curriculum, te whāriki. Te whāriki uses the metaphor of a woven mat or whāriki to represent the flexibility of this curriculum document. This is a non-prescriptive document and it acknowledges that each service can weave its own local curriculum that is responsive to its community, philosophies and bicultural approaches. Te whāriki is internationally celebrated for its bicultural inclusion, and it expresses the vision that all children is to grow up in New Zealand as confident and competent learners, strong in their sense of identity, language and culture. Te whāriki draws on traditional Māori concepts, and this vision implies that the society recognises Māori as tangata whenua, or the traditional peoples of Aotearoa, New Zealand. This assumes a shared obligation for protecting Māori language and culture. Te whāriki is made up of 4 principles and 5 strands. First principle is whakamana, or empowerment. Children are empowered to learn and grow, and the curriculum supports them to develop confidence, independence, and a strong sense of self-worth. My colleague in the symposium, Bev, will talk about agency, and I wanted to connect empowerment and agency together. While closely connected and very similar, agency could be viewed as the outcome of empowerment. A curriculum that empowers children fosters conditions where agency can grow. Holistic development, or kotahitanga, is the second principle. Children's learning and development are viewed as interconnected within this curriculum document. Physical, emotional, social, cognitive and spiritual dimensions are weaved and nurtured together. Whānau tangata and family community is the third principle. This is where the wider world of the family and community is integral to the child's learning. Therefore, partnerships with parents or whānau, the extended family and communities are essential. Ngā honanga, or relationships, is the fourth principle. Children learn through responsive and reciprocal relationships with people, places and things. Strong, respectful relationships are the heart of our curriculum. There are 5 strands. Mana atua, well-being, where the health and emotional well-being of the child is nurtured. Mana whenua, belonging, where there's a sense of connection and place. Mana tangata, contribution, which looks at opportunities to learn with and alongside others. Mana reo, communication, where children are encouraged to develop language and symbols for expressions, and mana atora, which is around discovering and making sense of the world. While Te Whāreki is designed for teachers to enact with children and implemented by kaiako, these strands and principles underpin all teaching and learning. For this presentation, I'm going to focus on the strand of belonging and the importance of belonging for both children and teachers in the early childhood sector. Te Whāreki has a strong vision that children know who they are, that they are accepted, and that they know that they can make a difference. Te Whāreki goes on to say that children should have a strong sense of belonging, and this contributes to their well-being. It gives children confidence to try new experiences. Te Whāreki also states that it's important for the curriculum to regularly show children's culture, language, and world views within the early childhood centres. It places relationships at the heart of teaching and learning, and these connections with the wider world are really important so children know they have a place and they feel comfortable with regular events, customs, and routines. Te Whāreki looks at belonging as being beyond people and that there is meaningful engagement with places and things. So familiarity with environments and culturally responsive interactions are really embedded in this strand. Belonging is complex though. It's multi-dimensional and it has varied definitions across literature. Essentially, belonging is a felt experience. It's a very personal perception shaped by interactions and the context or people, places and things. Because it's socially constructed, a person's sense of belonging can shift depending on the environment and the relationships that are within it. We do know that belonging is a fundamental human need. It influences motivation, well-being and engagement, so it is a fundamental strand for teaching and learning. After many years of teaching in early childhood education and beginning to understand the importance of belonging for children, I moved into Tertiary and began my Masters in Education. At the same time, I started visiting students while on practicum. And I encountered a student that was struggling to settle into her practicum centre. This was a student from a minority culture, and she was told that she should not speak her home language to a child with the same home language, and that she was to speak English in the centre. This got me thinking and was the birth of my research project. I began to think if belonging is so important for children and it's woven through our curriculum, is the same true for our kaiako or our teachers? Are our teachers more likely to engage in teaching, to experience an increased well-being and to be more confident if they have a strong sense of belonging? And as I mentioned earlier, it was these wonderings that led to my research project. So my research project looks at the importance of belonging for minority teachers in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It uses an interpretive paradigm which acknowledges that knowledge is fluid and individually constructed. I used a methodology exploring the lived experiences and how they make meaning, how my participants make meaning of these experiences. And they investigated this through using semi-structured interviews, which was done over Zoom. I had 6 participants and used thematic analysis to identify common themes and summarise those common threads. So I'd like you to take a minute and think about what belonging means to you. For me, it means being safe and secure, to feeling like I have a place to be connected. But this is not the view of all of my participants in my research. Many expressed concerns about being afraid to try new things, about having to fit in, that belonging is hard, They feel isolated. They had to change their behaviour. They had a fear of being judged, and this resulted in them stepping back. It is important to consider that when our teachers are experiencing this in the early childhood centres, it must be very hard for them to gauge an effective teaching and learning. Participants shared that through having a strong sense of belonging, they were open to new learning. 3 participants emphasised the importance of having their beliefs and values acknowledged or accepted. And in addition, a non-judgmental environment where voices were heard was mentioned twice. Analysis of the data showed that most kaiako indicated that if the environment felt like home, they'd feel more connected and have an increased sense of belonging. Feelings of home can ensure that kaiako or teachers feel that they are part of that environment and they don't have to fit in to feel included. But this is complex because feelings of home are different to each kaiako, as each home is different. So it's challenging for us to consider what home feels like to different teachers. As we read the statements from the participants on this slide, it's important to consider that how we do make those connections with home and the importance of knowing that for all teachers. It's also sad to consider that only 1/3 of my participants had ever been asked in a meaningful, authentic way about their experiences from home, their culture, or their identity. Generally speaking, there was limited or no effort made to find out more about the participants beyond the scope of their work. Stood out for me is that some participants felt that they had to fit in to settings, to fit in with the dominant norm. Monoculturalism can create dominant discourses and normalize mainstream ways of doing. This can create a pressure for some students or some participants in my research to conform, a pressure to align with that dominant expectation within their educational environments. And this was often manifested in subtle or overt ways. This was done because they had a fear of judgment, a fear of being judged. Their unjust scrutiny or ridicule, fear of being judged, created a climate of anxiety and self-censorship. As a result, some participants tried to change their appearance or their behaviour in order to assimilate that dominant discourse. Teachers in their centres would alter their appearance, their language, and their behaviour to try and mirror those dominant norms. And they wanted to be perceived as being more acceptable and more professional in these mainstream contexts. Ultimately, this led to a loss of personal values. In order to fit in, there was compromise or the need to suppress personal or cultural values. And this internal conflict eroded their sense of identity and diminishes the richness of multicultural learning environments. All of this led to assimilation, and the cost of assimilation is that we're prioritising sameness over difference. While this may offer a short-term inclusion for some of the participants, it often led to long-term consequences, including a loss of identity. Increasingly, this disconnect from the original sense of self can lead to a sense of loss where some students or some participants felt a diminished connection with ethnicity, language, or cultural heritage. Overall, all of this led to some sort of conflict of belonging where the need to conform create that disconnect between the professional role and that cultural identity. And whilst the participants in this research tried to let go of some of their original sense of culture and ethnicity to fit into the dominant norm, this resulted in them not being necessarily connected to the original ethnicity or culture, but not really fitting into the dominant one either. Participant 3 shared that belonging for her sits in tiny spaces where she's created belonging. And a lot of the time she's just trying to fit in because she doesn't want to be judged. Belonging relies on individuals feeling valued and included. It's about making relationships and social experiences, and respectful collaboration and relationships really support identity and that social connectedness. It's one of the key ingredients of belonging. It's really important to develop those strong reciprocal relationships where people feel valued, where they feel included, and where there's connections to places and things. Familiarity is really important, and it relies on often inclusive leadership, so the leader can model ways of including others. My research aligns with that of others, where their trends are alarming. The Educational Review Office in New Zealand reported 20% of learners from ethnic communities felt that they didn't experience a sense of belonging in their schools, and this led to isolation, loneliness, and exclusion from school activities. This report went on to highlight the importance of teachers being ethnically competent and inclusive, yet also acknowledged that while teachers were not connecting and responding to the growing ethnicities in Aotearoa, New Zealand, they also had limited awareness of the cultural needs of some ethnicities within our communities. In relation to teachers' sense of belonging, Griffiths et al. Found that attracting and retaining early childhood teachers can be problematic. Their research found that 48% of respondents reported one or more negative experiences related to their diversity. And while 87% provided examples of this discrimination, these statistics highlight the importance of addressing exclusion and discrimination and promoting a sense of belonging for all teachers. Similarly, research based in England by Bradbury found that nearly 1/3 of all minority teachers reported discrimination in the workplace in the last 12 months. These findings provided evidence of widespread disparities and marginalisations, and this was echoed by participants in my own research who shared stories of isolation and discrimination, particularly around language. This shows we need to look deeper at the underlying issues and create some solutions to overcome these barriers of inclusion. Te Whareki's foundation is embedded in Aotearoa New Zealand's bicultural roots and is aware of growing diversity. It affirms the rights for children to grow up strong in their identity, language and culture, to have equitable access to learning and the recognition of their identity. Yet with growing diversity and change, teachers are not keeping up with their knowledge of different cultures. Furthermore, Te Whareki is a non-prescriptive document. If teachers do not understand the importance of belonging and how to implement it, how are they going to foster belonging for their colleagues and for children? Chan recognises that while our curriculum framework is underpinned by bicultural language, it is embedded in dominant teaching approaches. This means that there is a risk that Te Whareki might actually reinforce monocultural norms and othering through these subtle ways. It requires us to reflect on both the visible and hidden barriers, that we need to challenge assumptions and stereotypes, and we need to challenge dominant norms. We need to develop shared values and cultural practices that enhance belonging for everybody. We need to confront othering. Othering excludes minority cultures via racism, sexism, ableism, and so on. These dominant discourses normalise some traits while marginalise others, and unless we start calling these out and addressing them, this will continue. The research quotes from my participants show that minority teachers still feel undervalued. They seek equality and respect, and we need to address these issues. Teams must engage in critical conversations to challenge otherings. While white privilege and identity normalisation can be addressed through reflective dialogue, we need to create spaces for these to happen. As I mentioned earlier, some kaiako or teachers felt a pressure to assimilate, often losing part of their identity, and this can lead to the internal conflict and a weakened sense of belonging. How can we address this? How can we have conversations to break down those so teachers don't feel they have to fit in to dominant ways of being and discourses? Moving forward, it's really important to understand that belonging requires time and space. The benefits of belonging include mental health, improved mood, improved resilience, and increased brain function. It can lead to greater confidence and engagement, where individuals feel that they can participate and take more risks. It's important that we learn about each person's culture, language, and worldviews, that we look at cultural responsiveness, as a lack of cultural representation can lead to exclusion and disconnect. Relationships are the key. Teachers must build trusting relationships through sharing values and beliefs and creating spaces for this to happen. It needs intentionality. It won't just happen without us being intentional about how that looks. Team conversations matter. We need to address barriers to inclusion and bullying. We need to look at ethnic and identity-based challenges for minority teachers and create those safe, inclusive spaces for regular dialogue. This effective communication can build shared understanding about belonging and create spaces where everyone is feeling confident to share and to be heard. Despite legal protections and early childhood guidance, diversity is often not celebrated in practice. And this is evident when kaiako express words like they want to be seen as important as other teachers or heard and respected in the same way. Griffiths points out that there's a lack of intention to explore ethnicity, and these assumptions persist within dominant discourses. Belonging grows through familiarity and cultural responsiveness, respect and values. So I call to action. I call that more must be done to support minority cultures, that belonging is essential for teacher retention, for risk-taking in practice, and for inclusive education. Inclusion means seeing, hearing, and celebrating all teachers and challenging these monocultural norms. And when I think back to younger me and I think about my own experiences at school, I can see now that I should not have been defined by an education system that failed to recognise my sense of belonging. That systems put in place to prevent homesickness drove a wedge between the two contexts and failed to acknowledge my identity. I am confident if I had a stronger sense of belonging that I would have achieved more at school and I would have challenged myself and taken more risks. Belonging doesn't happen by chance, it happens by choice. It's a choice to listen, to reflect, to challenge, and to change. It's making that choice is important, and in doing so we create spaces where every teacher feels valued, every child feels seen, and every community feels connected. So I ask you, how can you choose to support others to feel like they belong? How can you be the voice of inclusion and stand up for marginalisation? Ngā mihi koutou, ko Joe Ward Tako Ingoa, and I am standing up for belonging. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this presentation. Mā te wā.
Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for taking time to watch this video of the keynote presentation that I gave at the British Educational Research Association conference in September 2025. I am Bev Coombridge, an educator and researcher in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and today I'm sharing my research into how co-constructed assessment can nurture not just student agency, but also resilience in 5 to 7-year-old learners. Before I begin, I'd like you to consider your earliest memory of a time when you were assessed. Attach that memory Do you have feelings of joy, hope, sadness, anger? Memories and emotions are attached to assessment for the individual. Those memories and emotions may influence the choices we make in life, and yet, assessment in education is often framed as solely a measure of learning. Today, I want us to consider how the way we assess shapes not just what information we get, but it also impacts who the learner becomes. This study set out to do three things: explore, bridge, and contribute. Explore whether and how assessment design could nurture agency in very young learners. Bridge a gap that I saw between theory and the everyday realities of the classroom, particularly in the 5 to 7-year-old age range. And contribute practical ways of designing assessments that support agency without sacrificing the integrity of a knowledge-rich curriculum. The research question based on these three aims was, what, if any, are the best practices for designing assessments that nurture and enhance student agency for 5 to 7-year-old children? There were some significant hurdles to consider right from the start. First, every practitioner I spoke to seemed to have a different understanding of what student agency meant. Second, how do you measure something as internal as student agency in a meaningful way? And third, did agency matter? Why was I concerned about supporting student agency? Wasn't attainment much more important? I needed to put aside my own ideas about agency when considering this and think about a loud argument often highlighted in the media with a call for educators to move away from child-centered education to a knowledge-rich education. This argument seemed to imply that child-centered agentic learning and knowledge-rich curriculum were mutually exclusive. And this needed consideration because my research question brought these two concepts together, with agency and assessment linked. And finally, with 5 to 7-year-olds, there was this extra challenge, balancing agency with the developmental realities of dependence. All of these ideas shaped how I designed the study. The first of the issues that I looked at more closely was the definition for student agency. The literature offered many definitions, over 40 in fact. From all of those definitions, I considered those that were relevant to student agency with 5 to 7-year-olds and put forward this working definition for my study. Student agency is the process whereby an individual or group has the capacity, motivation, and resources to set a goal and purposely act to achieve it, resulting in individual or community change. The first thing to note here is the word process. Agency is a process. It is not static. It grows and changes over time and within different contexts. Two other words to take particular notices of: capacity and resources. And we're going to return to those two ideas in just a moment. The second issue that I identified earlier regarding how agency can be measured had a partial answer in a study from Vaughan et al. In a tool that was developed to measure student perceptions of agency in literacy education. The study had been used internationally and had consistent results in different cultures. With the author's permission, I adapted and used the student agency profile, which uses a Likert scale questionnaire to measure students' perceptions of 5 agency indicators: persistence, choice-making, self-perception, interactiveness, and intentionality. Each of the agency indicators had a direct relationship to the definition of agency in use in the study. The third issue that arose from the initial thinking around the research question is the perception that agency and knowledge are competing forces. The concept of child-centered freedom versus a teacher-led knowledge-based curriculum. The media and Aotearoa sometimes frame these competing forces as a return to basics, away from child-centered education. This either-or narrative does not fit with the definition introduced earlier. Knowledge in the definition is considered both a capacity and a resource. Because agency needs knowledge, and it is impossible to have the capacity to act and make decisions without the resources that knowledge provides. Knowledge is part of that capacity to act, as well as being the resource that is required for student agency to contribute to learning. When considered in this way, the idea that student agency needing both knowledge and capacity, it places the concept of student agency in education as complementary to and sitting within a knowledge-rich curriculum. Further to the working definition, the literature review in this study discovered some commonalities or overlaps between assessment and pedagogy that supported student agency, and we're going to look at those consistencies next. It was from these commonalities or crossover points that I developed the concept map for the study, and that would form the basis of my empirical research. When comparing the literature with implications to nurturing student agency, alongside the literature on effective assessment, there were 4 principles common to both fields of study, and 2 possible principles that, although not explicitly linked in the literature, appeared to me as a practitioner to possibly be linked. The principles that connect agency and formative assessment are in the center of the diagram on the screen. Students are considered knowledge builders. Classroom relationships impact both student agency and formative assessment. The use of culturally responsive pedagogy supports both agency and assessment, and throughout it all, dialogue and discussion are essential to both. There are also 2 sets of ideas that seem linked in practice but weren't really connected in the literature. And the first of these was about balance. With the 5 to 7-year-olds, we simply couldn't hand over all the control. Agency seemed to develop in partnership. And assessment also can reflect balance, sometimes self-assessment, sometimes peer assessment, and sometimes teacher-assessed. And each of those things has a different role within assessment. I wondered if these were linked. The second possible principle was about the nature of the learning or assessment task. In the early years, play-based, creative and imaginative activities often fuel agency. At the same time, effective formative assessment is highly interactive. To me, those 2 ideas felt like 2 sides of the same coin. I've seen interactive assessment at its most powerful when it draws on the spontaneity and engagement of play. And I wondered if these things were connected, and I placed them tentatively on the concept map to consider during the empirical research. I used a practitioner-led, culturally responsive action research model, not a researcher in a lab coat, but me in the classroom, part of the community, working alongside the children. This took place in 2 Year 2 classrooms with 8 small group projects. Each involved 6 to 8 children. Over 6 weeks, we met weekly to co-construct assessment tasks based on the term's learning goals. I gathered both quantitative data, the student agency profile questionnaires, and qualitative data from audio recordings and transcripts of our workshops. The format of this project started with a class meeting with the children in the group. where we talked about what had they been learning, what were the learning goals for this term, and how might they show that learning. They decided together how to sparkle. Sparkling was the term used for assessment in the project. The children already had the learning within them, but what they needed to do was show that learning to allow it to sparkle and shine through. Then each group had time to plan and act out their project. And each of those sessions, those workshops, were a mini action research cycle with the children, where they thought about what they needed to do, they had time to do that thing, and then towards the end of the session, they reflected on what had happened and what they would need for the next session. These workshops were followed by a sparkle time. That was where children were able to bring their teachers and their peers in to show their learning. And the final session was a reflection where the children looked at what did we do, what went really well, what would we change for next time. The children came up with wonderfully creative formats. One group made a brain tent with learning displayed inside a tent. Another group used a board game. There was a mini art gallery, a treasure map with clues, a Play-Doh mini world, even a movie. These were all student-led ideas, with my role being to help them access the resources they needed and to support them in deciding on a goal, taking steps towards that goal, and achieving change. The numbers showed significant growth in most indicators of perceived agency, with the Wilcoxon signed rank tests indicating significant change in the overall mean agency and in 4 of the 5 indicators. Persistence jumped from 3.74 to 4.21. That was the most significant change. Choice making and self-perception also rose notably. The one area that didn't shift much was interactiveness. How much students felt they could influence learning through working with others. I found this particularly interesting because the qualitative data showed students collaborating all the time. And this result seemed to indicate that perceiving influence through collaboration may need explicit scaffolding rather than simply facilitating students working together and assuming that they will recognize this. I was excited about the persistence gains, but as I listened to the students, I realized that something deeper was happening. This quote from a 7-year-old says it all. It's hard, but I want to be here and do it because I like it, but it's hard. And that's not just sticking with it. That's productive struggle. They weren't only persisting, they were learning how to handle frustration, adapt and bounce back, and that's resilience. And it seemed that agency and resilience were feeding each other in a cycle. The groups with higher agency had higher resilience, and those with lower resilience, there was lower agency. There seemed some sort of connection where each strengthened each other. So the framework I began with needed to change. The framework developed from a 2D map to a bird's eye, which was a bird's eye view, to a 3D model. And I now see assessment design and agency as 2 pillars connected by core principles. Students as knowledge builders, strong relationships, cultural responsiveness, dialogue and discussion. But the whole structure is held up by resilience. And resilience itself is strengthened and keeps its shape by agency and assessment. It's a mutually reinforcing loop. This model is a useful way to develop and design assessments, and further research is needed to test its validity in wider contexts. There were many moments during this research that challenged my thinking, but one I'd like to share that I feel is particularly pertinent to fellow researchers in education. came about during a classroom discussion about informed consent. A 6-year-old asked me, "Do we get to read what you write about us?" That question stayed with me. It reminded me that research isn't just about collecting data, it's about relationships and respect. So instead of just presenting findings to adults, I wrote a picture book inspired by the children's voices, ideas, and projects. It was based on their words and their adventure in learning. And it's called The Learning Adventurers Discover How to Sparkle. And it tells the story of agency, resilience, and assessment in a way that children can see themselves. The illustrations reflect their world, the metaphors echo their thinking, and the story belongs to them. And this wasn't just dissemination, it was a way of saying, you were here, you mattered, and this story belongs to you too. Yes, you get to read what I write about you. This small-scale research project offers room for thought and consideration. What would change if we saw every assessment not as an endpoint, but as a starting point, an opportunity for transformation? My findings show that in this context, agency and knowledge are not opposing forces. They strengthen each other. An assessment, when co-constructed, may shape who our students become as much as what they know. Let me take you to the school gate in New Zealand. I'm arriving early in the morning with a trolley of resources for children to use in their assessment project. One child is waiting for me to arrive and runs to the gate with an excited question. Fire Bev, is it time to sparkle now? The question is loaded with anticipation, with pride in work, and excitement to show others their learning. This image is the one I have in my mind when designing assessments, be it for young children, teenagers, or adults. When we assess, does the design we are using shape students that are agentic and resilient? Do our students, whether 5 in a primary school or 55 in a doctoral program, look forward to showing learning? Are they enthusiastic and have access to the tools to sparkle?
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry that I haven't been able to get to Beira in September 2025. So my name is Simon Taylor, and I'm from the University of Waikato in New Zealand. And my research at the moment is navigating challenges and highlights in cross-curricular STEAM education. I've been working with my wonderful colleague, Barbara White, and she's just retired recently, and we've been working together for a number of years on cross-curricular curriculum integration programs in primary and in secondary schools. And I work at the Tauranga campus here in the North Island of New Zealand. I suppose our main rationale and the purpose of the research was, how do secondary teachers transition their practice to meet the demands of a curriculum integrated program? We'd been working in primary schools, and we wanted to extend this project into secondary schools and really hear from teachers what they were going through, their highlights, their challenges, what the benefits for the program were. We wanted to embrace, Alison Cook-Sather's work, about the importance of the voice, about having agency in the learning, and she's been incredibly influential in my research. The methodology was, well, there were 8 secondary schools, there were 11 classes. It was, the main focus was with year 9 students, so this their first first experience in their secondary education. So it's their first year, and they're around about 13 to 14 years old. So we work with teachers very closely. We work with them in teacher meetings. We invited them to use a journal where they wrote down and described what the planning was like, the design of the program, and of course their weekly reflections about how things were going. And then in the final reflective phase, we interviewed the teachers at the end there for their, I suppose, their final reflective comments about how the program was going. We got ethics approval, and and it was really around the main research is action research, and obviously case studies. So we, of course, we always go back to the New Zealand curriculum, and what does that actually say? Well, not much really. So it's very brief. You know, all learning should make sense of the natural connections that exist between learning areas, and that link learning areas to the values and key competencies. So yes, I know there's been a lot of work in competency in New Zealand, but it didn't really tell us an awful lot of how teachers would actually do curriculum integration. And you know, I can see there's some gaps there that needs to be tidied up in the future if we want to pursue curriculum integration in secondary schools. So we looked at the three kind of dimensions of curriculum integration, and we went back to the teachers to talk about this, because I think one of the things that came out from the project is that not a lot of the teachers actually had any professional learning, or not much, very limited professional learning around what was curriculum integration, how would they facilitate that, how would they design a program like that. So one of the benefits of the research project was just a chance to actually talk about it and talk about what it was, how design programs could be put in place, at a Year 9 program. So we looked at multidisciplinary, which a lot of primary schools use, which is a sort of a thematic based topic, such as, say, dinosaurs or the Olympics, and of course all the curriculum subjects, such as, you would do English and dinosaurs, maths and dinosaurs, science with dinosaurs. So yeah, the context is very important, and so yeah, the subjects aren't particularly linked carefully. It's more of a segmented curriculum integration program. Then you move into interdisciplinary, which where mainly what we found in secondary schools was that they use skills. So they'd be looking at numeracy skills or reading and writing, literacy, and they would build the skills into the topics or the particular disciplines, such as science, social studies, health, technology, and so on. And then the last dimension there is the transdisciplinary, was probably the most challenging one, where all it goes from the fruit salad model to really something that all these connections are merged, and the product is, the links there are very, very subtle and need to be made explicit. So the main question was, what are the outcomes for learning? We wanted to focus on what were the learning, what was going on in the learning in the integrated program, what was the purpose for doing so. So that guides us. And then the next one was, what are the benefits and challenges? So we wanted to identify what was going well and what were the difficulties that teachers were doing. There were 4 findings, and I'll go through them in a little bit more detail. But yes, student advocacy, relationships, topics and planning, balance of exploration and of exploration and explanation, and schools and teachers. So the first one here, this is where a lot of the teachers, I mean, out of the 23 teachers, there would have been 20 would have all expressed this as a really important one, was the opportunity to be much more learner centered rather than teacher dominated in the learning. So we really felt that came through the interviews, and that was one of the codes that we that it was came up a lot. Generally speaking, I mean, this is a very generalistic kind of finding, but yeah, we did notice there was a lot of student motivation and engagement in the learning in these particular classes. Now, whether that is to do with the curriculum integration or whether that is to do with the enthusiasm and the sort of positiveness of the teacher, it's very hard to pin that down. But generally speaking, when you compare a single subject, teaching going on versus this kind of curriculum integration program, we did notice there was a lot of engagement going on. We couldn't say all learners were engaged, but a good proportion, good majority of them were. The last point there is that teachers definitely said that working with other teachers from other curriculum areas was a huge benefit to them. For the first time, many of them felt that they weren't isolated anymore and that they were actually coming together, working together, and they felt joy from that. So that was really good to hear. So this is Sophia. She's one of the teachers. She's a very experienced teacher, and her background is in technology. And she I think she emphasizes the importance of actually listening to students where they're from, not rushing. She said that the program needed to be flexible for this, that the whole idea of curriculum integration is to focus on the learner itself, the learner themselves, and to find out where they were at with their learning. So I thought that was interesting. The next finding is topics and planning, and I think a little bit like Neen, our research, really complemented that, and that we felt that none of the kind of programs really fitted with those definite dimensions of curriculum integration. We couldn't put hand on heart and say, oh, well, that's definitely transdisciplinary or that's multidisciplinary. A lot of it was a bit fuzzy. We found that the topics that were used in the programs, they fitted very well with relevance and real world contexts, and that's what teachers used. They said that they needed an umbrella topic, and that specific background knowledge was important. And this is where Jean has said she's at a rural school, and she says that planning is incredibly important for curriculum integration, perhaps even more so than specific curriculum lessons. So yeah, she really believes that. She says here, each unit uses a topic such as Papatuanuku, the Earth Mother figure. This is a mix of earth science, social studies, which includes the local Maori history of the land and drama. The students learn about the topic through different cultural perspectives. They take part in role plays. So yes, so she believed that the ability to design and plan the program was incredibly important for success. And this is the other thing that came up, was this tension, this balance between the agency of the learner, the ability to explore and ask questions and to see those links between the curriculum integration, but also times where the teachers had to pull them back and say, hey, there's some gaps here, we need to actually address, this idea of photosynthesis, say. And so there was this tension between the sort of advocacy or agency of the learner, but also, the knowledge of having content knowledge, which was important. And this is Rob, and Rob is was an interesting teacher because he was working in a very remote rural school, very small role there, 192 students, and he'd been teaching there for 22 years, and he had taken this particular curriculum integrated class for many years, and this is what he said. He said that it was a juggling act, that the importance of having freedom for the agency of the student, but also he knew that there were certain skills or competencies around a particular curriculum area that needed to be looked at and addressed. So and he said this was the tension around that. Yeah. And then, of course, we looked at the schools and teachers. So we found that one of the things I thought was successful about the programs that we saw was that they still taught, I think it was, yes, 5 of the 8 schools still taught single subject specific classes in the main areas. But they also had, in addition to that, there was like 3 hours in the week where they did this curriculum integrated program, and they said that this was most successful. Many of the teachers said that the integrated curriculum is demanding. I mean, none of them said it was easy, and I think it involves a lot of planning and a lot of kind of changes in the timetable and support from the hierarchy in the school to actually get this thing going. They definitely said that there needed to be more opportunities for professional development, as that many felt kind of on their own. If it wasn't for Barb and I to come along and actually support them in the learning, they really didn't. They really felt that they were sort of building the plane as it was flying. I've been working with Dr. Paul Lowe on how we would create this kind of conceptual model of STEAM integration. And I mean, it's still very draft. We've written quite a bit about it, but we were always thinking of changing it. But yeah, we think of 4 dimensions with STEAM. So we know the importance of being student-centered, learner-centered. We know that the importance of actually collaboration and cooperation. So the ability for students to actually genuinely cooperate, and that means actually explicit teaching that. It's not something that's just done through osmosis or it just happens. It actually has to be created and facilitated by the teachers. And then there's the inquiry aspect, where we wanted to ensure that there was creativity and innovation that came out, particularly with technology and science, and the aspect of STEAM, which was really using the aspect of the arts, drama, role playing, visual art, in conjunction with science and technology. So I think next steps. I think really it's the most experienced or the most enthusiastic staff who participate, and I think the real challenge is with if you were to facilitate or present this across a whole cohort, all the year 9 students in a school, I think that would be demanding. I think that I think there is definitely curriculum integration can complement single subject teaching. It doesn't necessarily mean it abandons single subject teaching. I see that there are definitely specific skills required, but it definitely complements it, because of course they see the connections and this motivation and all these other aspects of the benefits of the program. I'd like to thank the teachers, of course, and the school leaders who help us with the research in the schools, and my thanks, of course, to the students who let us in the classes, and it's a really wonderful, rich project to be involved in, and of course my very special thanks to my wonderful colleague Barb White. Thank you. These are the references.